From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Hello, welcome to another edition of the McLaughlin Group. I'm your host, Tom Rogan. This week's guests are the familiar faces of Eleanor Clift, Clarence Page, and Pat Buchanan. And our special guest this week is Dr. James Boyes, an historian and author. On that note, we shall get to our first issue, which is issue 1, DNC.
He is clearly in over his head. He cannot meet this moment. He simply cannot be who we need him to be for us. It is what it is.
Democrats this week crowned Joe Biden as their presidential nominee, mostly virtual due to the coronavirus pandemic. The Democratic National Convention offered a familiar mix of political passion and patent partisanship. But while Joe Biden was repeatedly saluted as the man to lead America forwards, his opponent, President Donald Trump, also featured heavily. Some believe the focus on Trump illustrates the Democratic Party assessment that Biden's greatest strength is the fact that he is not Donald Trump.
Pat, your thoughts on the Democratic Convention and this balancing of new ideas and scathing attacks on President Trump?
Well, I think it was in good part a success, a technical success, certainly. I think they showed the unity and diversity of the party. They reintroduced Kamala Harris in a kinder, gentler role than the lady of the debate and the lady that went after Judge Kavanaugh. They also went after Donald Trump as the Lucifer of America, responsible for 170,000 American deaths and a threat to democracy if we reelect him. I've never seen anyone pounded so hard. But there was 2 places where they failed. They did not address at all or even raise the issue of the real violence and riots and disorders that are continuing night after night in Democratic cities in blue states like Portland and Seattle and Chicago and New York. And so that's one of the problems they're going to have to deal with. The second is we haven't heard from Joe Biden. And this is the big event of this convention is tonight. Everybody, including half the Democratic Party, fears that there may be some problem with Joe. So everybody's going to be watching tonight for that.
Eleanor, your thoughts?
I think it was a tremendous success. I think it alters conventions forever going forward. There was an intimacy about this that you couldn't get in a large hall with people wearing funny hats and clapping and yelling and screaming. I think the women, Michelle Obama, this woman has sold 10 million books. She is an incredible communicator. And she made the point that President Trump is not up to the job. Secondly, Joe Biden's wife, Jill Biden, made the connection between the healing of a broken family when she married Joe Biden after the death of his wife and a daughter, and the healing of a nation, speaking from an empty schoolroom. It was powerful stuff. And then 2 former presidents, Bill Clinton made the case that if you want a president who watches television all day and tweets, Trump's your man. And Barack Obama came in, it was his idea that he should speak before Kamala Harris so that Kamala Harris could use her time to tell her very powerful story, which is an American story, again, of blended roots, blended marriage, and diversity. And Barack Obama made the case that our democracy is at stake. Nothing less than our democracy is at stake. And Barack Obama, his idea was to follow in the footsteps of the 2 Bush presidents, to be gracious to his successor and not speak out. He has largely held to that, no more. And I think that was is being communicated to Democrats. Okay. Vote as if your life depends on it, because it does.
Right. James, do you think there is a challenge here for Democrats that they may have been too scathing, too extreme in terms of their presentation of what a second Trump term would be, in the sense that in 2016, we heard a lot of those messages. They didn't get through, evidently, and the world, at least for the moment, hasn't blown up.
Well, I think it's important to consider the fact that all conventions have to try to do at least 2 things. First, they have to advocate their candidate, in this case, Joe Biden, and to diminish their opponent, in this case, Donald Trump. They've certainly done that. As Eleanor was rightly pointing out, they have rolled out the big guns in an attempt to do so. And we've heard very, very explicitly from former President Barack Obama his views on Donald Trump and his presidency. I think that the great challenge the Democrats face, however, is not, are they going to be accused of doing too much in terms of going after Donald Trump? Because I think two things are clear here. One is that many people's views of Donald Trump have been baked in long ago. If you look at his opinion poll ratings, they really haven't fluctuated very much. They certainly haven't really climbed over 50%, which most presidents would expect at some point in their administration. And finally, I think it's important to remember that we need to consider the problem of the Democrats of getting people out to vote. Hillary lost 4 years ago, not because of a great spike in Republican turnout, but simply because people of color and women in particular simply didn't support Hillary Clinton in the way that many people expected to. And you saw a 5 million decline in the Democratic turnout. They simply have to vote, as Eleanor rightly pointed out, as though their lives depended upon it. And if they don't go out to vote, decisions are made by people who show up. And we will have to wait and see quite how the figures bounce after both conventions have been held, I think.
Clarence, your thoughts?
I noticed a real contrast with 4 years ago. We had President Trump talking about America as American carnage, a real apocalyptic vision. The streets were on fire. Listen to Donald Trump's descriptions, and I was there both at the convention inauguration, and I said, "That's America, the current America." It was Donald Trump's imagination, but for his base, many of whom were a lot more rural and outer suburban than the Democratic base, that was their vision of the city. You don't need to show riots on the streets now, Pat, because they've always been there as far as Donald Trump's base is concerned. But now look what's happening. Under Donald Trump's presidency, we really do have riots on the street. We really do have buildings being set on fire. It's still not an apocalyptic America, but I'll blame President Obama for being no more Mr. Nice Guy now. Last time he followed the usual tradition of not being critical of his predecessor. Now all bets are off because Donald Trump hasn't hesitated to be critical of him. And Obama laid it out that yeah, folks, we got kids in cages now. We've got visions you thought that couldn't happen. It's happening. And it's going to get worse. Both he and Michelle and others touched on this. But it's certainly... I would say the contest is on now. We're going to have a real conflict of visions, if you will, between these two presidents, one current president, one ex-president. Right. And that's what the debate is now. Can the Democrats bring us back to a more normal America?
So we've got about 3 minutes left. So if we quickly go around the table again with some final thoughts. Pat, you go first, and then I'll go to Eleanor.
Yeah, I think we've got about 11 weeks to the election. And these demonstrations, riots, pillaging, they're continuing and getting worse and worse. And many people in these states, which are all very big liberal blue states, are really reacting hostilely to what's going on, and they want it stopped. Secondly, as to Barack Obama, clearly he was in some despair and anguish and hurt and angry, and it came through authentically. But I don't think that's effective because that goes against the grain.
Eleanor.
Well, Pat gave away the dirty little secret that we're taping this on Thursday before Joe Biden speaks, so he could float out the idea that Biden is not up to it. We'll see about that. And talking about the carnage going on in the various cities, the carnage that's going on is 170,000 Americans have died from the coronavirus. Attempts to open up schools have been shut down immediately, college campuses, K through 12 schools, because they can't get a grip on reining in a virus. And everybody agrees that Trump has failed in his job as a national leader. He owns the country. It's not each individual governor owning his state. The lack of a national plan and the lack of any courage to even suggest people should wear masks, the failure lands at the doorstep. And the president, I don't know how they're going to handle that at the convention next week, because the happy talk that he spins forth in the White House press room is not going to sell nationally.
James.
So the Democrats have had the slight disadvantage of going first. They've had to nurture this new technology. They seem to have done that pretty well. But of course, what that gives is the Republicans the advantage of going second, so they can react very much to everything that the Democrats say this week. It's going to be fascinating to see how they handle technology, how they handle the setting in contrast to what the Democrats have done this week. I heartily imagine they're going to go after Kamala Harris with a scorched earth policy, quite frankly, of suggesting that she'll be a heartbeat away from the presidency. And to echo what Pat was saying, raising all kinds of health concerns about Joe Biden as a result of that. Do you really want this woman a heartbeat away from the presidency with the brief resume that she has to her advantage? And finally, also, I'm sure they'll go after the Democrats' use of Hollywood superstars to introduce these individuals on a nightly basis. And again, hark that back to Hillary Clinton 4 years ago, suggesting that the Democrats would rather be hanging out with the likes of Kanye West and Jay-Z, for example, than normal Americans.
All right, Clarence.
Kanye's on the Republican side now.
Yeah, I know, I realize that.
Kanye's running against President Trump. This is now a turnout game. Hillary Clinton certainly touched on it. This is not woulda, coulda, shoulda. The victory last time around came down to a few thousand people in the right states, and that's probably going to be what happens again this time. And it's very important that the Democrats stress this point. I think they made the point very well this week. And that's going to be also an issue about experience. How about Donald Trump's experience? When he came into office, his experience was mainly in television. And he showed himself to be a terrific TV performer and even TV director or producer. But when it comes to handling a crisis, especially a crisis he did not create himself, like both the coronavirus and the troubles in the streets, the racial reckoning, he's proved himself to be quite inept, although he constantly talks and says things people know aren't true. It's going to be interesting to see how far he can get with that this time around.
All right, we will move on. Issue 2, going postal.
House Speaker Nancy Pelosi this week accused President Trump of slowing mail delivery and handicapping the U.S. Postal Service. While proposed Postal Service changes have now been rescinded by Postmaster General Louis St. Joy, Speaker Pelosi has recalled the House of Representatives for an August 24th hearing and is demanding DeJoy testify. But the story doesn't end there. President Trump denies the Democratic allegations, but insists mail-in voting carries many risks.
If you look at what happened in New York and Virginia and various other places, it's a catastrophe. They're losing 20% of the votes. Nobody knows what's happened.
Eleanor, your thoughts on President Trump's approach to this issue and whether Democrats are, creating a storm in a teapot with the mail concerns?
President Trump has clearly been laying the groundwork to question the legitimacy of an election if he doesn't win. And he has raised all of these questions about potential fraud with mail-in votes. And he's also trying to set up a differentiation between absentee ballots and mail-in ballots. And you can look at some recent elections in Arizona, for example. Martha McSally was ahead in her Senate race in 2018, but she lost after the mail-in ballots were counted. Polls show Republicans prefer to vote in person, Democrats favor mail-in. I think it's very obvious what the president is doing, trying to create the groundwork for challenging. And you have an election credibility or crisis task force operating at Georgetown that have done all these tabletop exercises about different outcomes. And the one common ground with all of the outcomes is that we're going to be counting for weeks, maybe months after. There'll be lots of litigation. People could well be taken to the streets on both sides. And so I think it's a very real issue. And the Postmaster General is a Trump appointee, a big Republican donor. If you look at the makeup of the Board of Governors of the Post Office, there is a former RNC chairman. DeJoy consulted with the White House before he met with members of Congress. So there's real potential here for mischief.
Yeah, I think I'll use Eleanor's word here, is that's the potential. There's an enormous potential for fraud and there's potential for a debacle. We got to remember that the Florida election back in year 2000 was decided by 500 votes, and it went on for weeks and weeks and weeks and divided the country. And the problem here, attendant problem here is, I don't deny the Postal Service is going to do a good job, but you're sending out mail to 100 million people, let's say. They send back in, say, I'd like a ballot. Then you send the ballots out, and then you send them in. Who picks them up? Who harvests the votes? All of these things could happen, not necessarily because of fraud, but they create problems, I think, that if this is a close election, it's going to be a real occasion for the history books of the United Division of the United States and what Barack Obama was talking about, questions about the nature of democracy.
Clarence, there is a risk, though, isn't there, that whether it's fraud, which seems perhaps more unlikely, perhaps the president is overplaying that, but that the simple mechanics of delivering tens of millions or hundreds, more than 100 million pieces of mail, that this election may be brought into question with real legitimacy.
I don't think so. I have a lot of faith in the post office, not just because my grandparents happened to meet working at the post office, but we've had a post office in this country since we've had a country. And they do a remarkable job for all the knocks they take. I mean, for a matter of pennies, they will mail your letter all the way from Florida to Alaska or California to Massachusetts or whatever. And this is the fact is they're good at jobs like this. The fraud charge, and I've told you my adventures before about working on fraud investigations in Chicago. I've been familiar with voter fraud and charges of it for many years. And frankly, it's not in how you deliver the vote, it's how you count the vote where fraud occurs. And what little fraud that we do know about was caught. That's why we know about it. Okay. I mean, so there's always going to be a sore loser who's going to make some complaint about that, but I don't see it really happening.
All right, James, before we fly off to the Middle East, your thoughts?
Yeah, so clearly the Postal Service is in a new era with lots of new competitors, both physical and virtual. The challenge, though, now is that it's facing a great threat from this president, who's clearly trying to undermine it in the eyes and the perspective of many voters. Your question earlier to Clarence was with regard to this apparent surge, but it's been noted that even if half of all registered voters chose to vote by mail this time, it wouldn't result in as large a surge in the post as you get every Christmas in this country. So very clearly, the United States Postal Service, whatever challenges it has, can handle the surge that it would get with regards to this. I know we're talking about lawsuits here, but very clearly, I think the reason the Democrats are litigating this is because they're trying to demonstrate a point here. This is about public confidence. And it reminded me a little bit about that idea that you have newspapers with lots of flashy allegations, and everybody remembers the allegations, but they don't remember the retraction afterwards. So I think there's a real attempt here by the Democrats to adopt a belt and braces approach to defending the United States Postal Service.
All right, let's move on to issue 3, Israel-UAE deal.
And if we join forces, we can do wonderful things, limitless things, for the benefit of our people, for their well-being, and for their security.
Israel and the United Arab Emirates have agreed to establish full diplomatic relations, brokered by the Trump administration and Jared Kushner in particular. The deal will see Israel suspend claims of sovereignty over areas of the West Bank. The agreement reflects the increasingly close cooperation between Israel and the Sunni Arab monarchies of the Middle East. In large part, this warming of relations situates alongside shared concern over Iran's foreign policy, in particular, Tehran's ballistic missile and nuclear programs.
Clarence, surely this should be something that the media should be giving more attention to, a quite striking success for Trump diplomacy, no?
It really is, and there's no question about that, but the irony is that President Trump is so good at generating news of his own and various crises or whatever that we've hardly got time for another one. Oh yeah, there's peace in the Middle East. Okay, maybe after the morning news or something. It's really the kind of a deal though that I'm wondering just how situation specific this is, because the UAE and Israel had good reasons for wanting to come to the table this time, but that's how good deals are made, for mutual benefit, and part of it is their mutual fear and concerns about Iran, which can also be helpful with pulling other Middle East countries into the kind of relationship that Israel has had for a long time with Jordan and Egypt. This could be the beginning of something good.
Pat, your thoughts?
I think it certainly is a victory for Bibi Netanyahu, who was backing away from his annexation promises to the folks on settlers on the West Bank. And now he gets this. It's sort of a breakout for Israel after relations with the Egyptians and with the Jordanians. And you hear that Sudan and others, Oman, might come in and the rest of it. But already the bloom is off the rose. The Saudis, who are the big player on the Gulf, the Saudis are saying until and unless the Israelis address the Palestinian issue, we're not moving to recognition. They obviously are hearing from the Palestinians and from the Arab street. So it's a victory for Bibi Netanyahu. I don't think it's as big a deal as Sadat coming to Jerusalem.
Right. Eleanor, your thoughts?
Well, to give Jared Kushner his due, he did float this peace plan between Israel and the Palestinians that went nowhere, but it was all premised on economic activity. And this is the deal between the UAE and Israel. The UAE, home of Dubai, is a thriving business center. And Israel barely conducts any business within the Middle East region. And so they're looking for somebody to do business with. So there are mutual interests there, but it's based on thin ice in the sense that the UAE understands that Netanyahu has put aside permanently any thought of annexing the West Bank. And Netanyahu says, oh, that's temporary. And when Kushner was asked, what do you mean by temporary? He said, well, not a short time, but we don't know how long a time. In other words, maybe that's face saving for both sides. Maybe it's a fine condition, but I think this is a deal rooted very much in short-term political and commercial interests.
James, there is an argument though with Mustafa al-Kadhimi, the Iraqi prime minister, coming to the White House this week as well, taking on a tougher stance against Iran. The Sunni Arab monarchies aligning with the United States, at least on paper and behind the scenes, the Saudis with the Israelis, that Trump don't have here a narrative that counterposes against the Obama-Iran narrative. What say you to that?
Well, there's no doubt at all, I think, that anything that can be done to reduce tension in the Middle East must be welcomed and applauded, and that those plaudits should go to all concerned, irrespective of whether they be Democrats or Republicans, whether that be Donald Trump or Jared Kushner. I think the challenge, though, geopolitically, is that this administration seems to have difficulty in getting out of its own way, because in the very same sort of news cycle that we're hearing about this development between the UAE and Israel, we're now also hearing about pushback against Iran, for example. There are moves this week at the United Nations to instigate the snapback that would be moving against those developments that the Obama administration had instigated. That, of course, doesn't just impact the United States and Iran, but it also puts America's European allies, Britain in particular, in a very tricky situation about where it's going to sit. The United Nations, as a forum, of course, has been the place this has been organized, but the European partners have been far more positive about this Iranian deal than this administration. Right. And when you see the very short time period between now and the election, I think you're going to see an awful lot of fence sitting by America's allies ahead of this election cycle.
Okay, good points. We shall move on. Predictions, Pat.
I think the fundamental social issue of the fall campaign is going to be abortion. The reason is Joe Biden has moved very far to the left on that. He's against the Hyde Amendment. And I think the Catholic Church and the Catholic hierarchy very probably will be forced to speak up, and this will divide the Catholic community over the social issue of 2020.
Eleanor.
I'm tempted to predict the Catholic Church will not come out in support of Donald Trump. But my prediction really is, looking ahead to the Republican convention next week, George W. Bush, living ex-Republican president, will not be there. Among the featured speakers are the couple that pulled guns out at peaceful protesters. They'll be speaking, and also the My Pillow guy, who's pitching a plant-based antidote allegedly to the coronavirus that has caught the president's attention. I realize as a voter, I'm not the target audience for the Republican convention, but man, I don't understand who is.
Okay, let's go to James.
Since both Eleanor and Pat raise Catholics, let's continue that theme. I believe my prediction will be that the shock endorsement by Speaker Pelosi this afternoon of Joe Kennedy will end a last-minute surge, which has been apparent here in Massachusetts for Senator Ed Markey, and ensure the election of Robert Kennedy's grandson, Joe Kennedy, doubtless therefore setting up expectations of a future presidential run by the end of this decade.
Very good. Clarence.
I see a building economic crisis in college towns around the country, as one university after another says that they're not going to open at least on-campus classrooms, and universities and healthcare have been the two biggest growth industries to help revive our various declining cities, and that's going to prolong the economic recession that we're beginning to see now.
Okay, I predict that the star of the Republican convention will be Alice Johnson, a former federal prisoner who President Trump released. And I think that will be a quite striking dichotomy with some of the narratives that sometimes are presented from the Trump campaign. Thank you for watching.